Now summer is well underway and you might be revisiting the sounds of jungle and drum and bass. So I wanted to put this groove template together for you so that you have plenty of options to choose from. Now of course something to bear in mind is that a lot of drum and bass music is made up of famous breaks. These breaks can be things like the Amen break or something that we have here called the Think break. It comes from Lynn Collins' Think About It and it sounds like this. When you start to pitch this up, it becomes more familiar. Something that could be quite helpful to know is that if you're in Ableton and you warp a sample, you can then right click it and slice to new MIDI track. Your break is separated up evenly and on each key is a part of that break. What that allows you to do is create a whole new rhythm on those slice margins. This is all helpful prior knowledge, but it isn't part of the groove template. Today's video is actually going to focus on more than 5 grooves, but some of them are awfully similar. So I wanted to keep it easy for the title of the thumbnail. Why don't we dive into creating drums from MIDI? Whilst that loads, don't forget that today's video is sponsored by DistroKid. They make my life so much easier when it comes to uploading my music to over 200 music platforms. I often make use of their promo cards and their hyperfollow tool, which you can copy and paste into your social media bios. Makes it really easy for your audience to pre-save your music. If you want to get 7% off your first year, then just use the link in the description below. Now let's dive into it. All right, so here I've got a plethora of different grooves for you. If we wanted to go with something that was similar to the Think groove, I would go with the classic. Check it out. So the Think groove is pretty similar, and one of the things that I really wanted to pay attention to was replicating space. We haven't got too many sounds in the drum rack here. Each drum rack is going to be laid out awfully similarly. We've got a live kick here, a ghost snare, another ghost snare, and the main snare here. Now, if you've seen my video on how to make more realistic grooves, I'll link it in the top right. I'm using a similar technique. I'm duplicating the snare to the left and then duplicating the snare to the right. This means that on the left, I can create a variation of that main snare, and the same goes for the right. You can see on the right, I'm warping this snare by beats and bringing that envelope all the way down after hitting the forward mode. With the snare on the left, I'm just creating a mighty fade out, and then in controls, detuning this snare a little bit, as well as applying some volume variation. I've got an extremely tight hat here, a little perk, and a little tambourine hit. I've transposed the tambourine up quite high by 9 semitones. The main thing that makes this beat feel a little bit more realistic, like the Think groove that you just heard, is the use of space. I've used this ballad reverb preset and then just EQ'd that space to make sure that everything sits in a physical room. So that snare sounds a little bit more like it is taking place in a hall. I've also got a snare that's high and a snare that's a little bit lower. Again, if you've seen my previous episodes on realistic drum grooves, then you'll know that the drummer hits the snare often in different places, which creates different pitches. And that's why in the Lynn Collins Think groove, you've got this high snare and this low snare. But if you want something a little bit more modern, then check out Summer's Here. You'll notice that it's a lot more tight and a lot more pleasing to the ears. Okay, so with this groove, we're looking at something ultra simple. With almost all of the beats we're looking at, we've got an on-beat, off-beat kick drum pattern. That means the first kick falls on the on-beat, then the second kick on the off-beat. With the snares falling on 2 and 4. You'll notice that with this beat, we're just pulling that snare a little bit forward off of the grid line to give it that kind of rushed feel. It all adds to the humanization of the beat. The cymbal I have falling on the 1 and 3 quarter note margins. And then backing that snare up with a little rim shot. It's just going to help it cut through the mix, but it's not imperative to the groove. We're going to have hi-hats on every 8th note margin. And to give it extra bounce, you're going to make sure that the first hi-hat has a loud velocity and the second hi-hat a slightly more quiet velocity. Often for the chorus section, you're just going to introduce a double time tambourine. Now, if you're part of the Patreon community, I've obviously put this groove template together for you so that you can download it and introduce your own sounds. I have that chorus section on a new tab, so you can just switch between. With the tambourine, I've also got that loud, quiet velocity to allow for a little bit of dynamic playing. Let's move on to the Liquidator, which once again isn't too far from what we've already heard. All right, so with the Liquidator, we've got the ride on the downbeat, and instead of a second ride cymbal falling on the third quarter note, just before it, we've reversed that sample. We've still got that on-beat, off-beat kick drum, but one margin before that third quarter note, I've got a real quiet kick drum. This is just gonna act as a little accidental in the recording. Again, realism is everything. As per, we've got our snares, but because this is more of a liquid drum and bass sound, I'm also backing the snares up with a piece of Foley. The hi-hats are much the same as the last groove, but we're backing up those hi-hats with an extra perk that falls on the second hi-hat marker and then falls offset between the fourth and fifth hi-hat sounds. And then for the first time, I've got two tabla samples. And they're just going to play in between my beats, acting as ghost notes. As before, add that tambourine for your chorus section. You'll notice that on this track, the tambourine's playing slightly different to as it was on the last track, where it was playing pretty much on every 16th note. This tambourine does play loud, then quiet, but I've also put it into a different kind of rhythm so that we don't hear it through the entire beat. The Summers Here chorus section, we had a tambourine that played constantly, and the ride cymbal was pretty much on each quarter note. We do a similar thing with the Liquidator's chorus section, but unlike its predecessor, I'm sidechaining that ride cymbal. So all I've done is add the shaper device and tied that gain to the output of a utility. That's gonna give it a really bouncy feel and make this feel quite noisy. Moving on from this, we've got the Keep It Simple beat. You'll notice with this beat, the pattern is real easy to see. Kick, hi, snare, kick. And we use it in a kind of polymeter style groove. At the very end of the 4-bar groove, this is the longest groove we're gonna look at, we just create a little bit of a fill out of very tight percussion. This is the loudest, longest piece of percussion we have just to accent the groove. But after that, I've got a very tight hi-hat, very tight piece of perk, and another hi-hat sound to accent this. I like to make sure that the first drum fill is different to that of the second drum fill, so I've taken away this very long piece of perk. This works really well within the liquid genres, and if you want to mix things up, you can always add a little fill from our next groove too. That next groove is called the 90s Junglist. This looks like a very busy, overwhelming kit, but don't worry, it's just made out of lots of different ghost notes. Let's dive into it. All right, let's get the easy bit over and done with. We've got a kick on the downbeat, and then we've got a kick followed by another kick on the 8th note marker. Here's our offbeat. So we're kind of elongating that on-beat, offbeat pattern. And here's our rim shot. We've still got that downbeat snare here, but where we'd normally have the offbeat kick rhythm, we're applying it to where the snare would be. Now you can see that there's a lot of ghost notes here. So again, what I'm doing is moving my rim shot left, moving my rim shot right, but I'm also using a variation of snare samples. The first variation comes from here. You can see moved left, moved right. And I'm just going up and down, making sure that we don't have the ghost notes be next to each other too often. If we had something like this, even though that there's velocity there, you would be able to tell that it's the same sample. So what we want to do is create a little bit of variation by having this up-down fill. Again, we're trying to add to the humanization. So add a couple of variations of a snare sample, which has a little bit more attack or a different sound. And then after that, our hi-hats are very simple. You see this hi-hat pattern at the top, super rhythmical, super quantized, two hi-hats that accent each other on the downbeat. And then we've got our 8th note hi-hat. And then at the very top, I have this really punchy snare, which lines up with all my rim shots. You can make tons of variations from this. What I would suggest is if you do make a groove like this, instead of drawing in everything to the piano roll, create your first rhythm, then use that MIDI slice trick from the beginning of the episode, and you can create a ton of variations. Finally, we're on to the glitch stepper. Check this out. This one looks super confusing, right? But make no mistake, we've still got that on-beat, off-beat pattern with a couple of ghost notes from a little toy snare underneath. After that, it was about creating a smattering of ASMR-like sounds. If you go to Splice, you can find a bunch of ASMR-like sounds that have all of these glitchy textures, which is what I used for this. So inside the rhythm, I created 4 different little glitch patterns. These sounds you're going to want to set to warp, choose beats, mode forward, and bring that envelope down from 100 to 0. You might even want to transpose these little ASMR sounds to make sure that they're really tight. My hat falling on the first downbeat, then the 4th quarter note margin, and then on the offbeat and on the 3rd quarter note margin. So kind of filling in the blanks of where I missed it the first loop round. This is going to create a nice, interesting pattern that isn't too repetitive with the hi-hat. 2 perk samples, and I'm putting these next to each other on the 2nd and 3rd 16th, and then pretty much in the middle after that, first on its own, then together, then on its own, and then we repeat that pattern. And then the only thing that I do at the end to give it a little bit of an accent to that final hit is add this lovely water droplet. And that just kind of backs up the toy-like, the ASMR-like sound of this glitchy beat. So there we have it. We kind of looked at 7 grooves if we include chopping up the Lynn Collins Think Groove. As I said, if you're part of the Patreon community, you can download this groove template and then fill in the drum racks with your own sounds. Let me know which are your favorite grooves and what you'd like to see in future episodes, as well as if you'd like to see another groove template video. It's been wonderful to sit down with you guys, and I'll see you next time.